Well, Mike, I appreciate you being on the program with me. I want to focus on Czechoslovakia and especially the economy of that country. And so I invited you to be on the program because I know a little bit about your background. I believe you were born in Slovakia and have been back in Czechoslovakia, so you have some sense of that country and I think a care and love for it. That is true, you were born there, not so?
Yes, it is.
In Slovakia?
In Slovakia, in a little town called Šváby, which is outside a eastern town in Slovakia called Prešov.
Mm-hmm. Well, as soon as we say Slovakia, we distinguish that from the Czech side. The Czech-speaking, usually considered to be Bohemia and Moravia put together. A lot of times the Czechs these days call that just Bohemia. And I must say that I myself, my roots are in the Czech side of it, but very close to the Slovak border. Mm-hmm. So I suppose one of the questions here is, can a Slovak and a Czech talk about this modern-day state of Czechoslovakia, especially the economy that from that viewpoint?
I think there's a very big question there because I suspect a lot of Americans don't realize that the Czech part of Slovakia and the Slovak part were separated once upon a time. They were joined together at the beginning of the 20th century, I think around 1917 or so. The two groups, the Slovaks and the Czechs, have traditionally been quite different in terms of their economies. The Czech economy tends to be much more industrial, whereas the Slovak economy is much more agrarian, much agriculture in the Slovak side. The two groups also tend to not like each other very much, and they've been staying together largely because of political, legal reasons. There's even a movement currently, again, to separate off Slovakia from the Czech part. In fact, I found it quite intriguing in Czechoslovakia that everyone writes the name of the country, Czechoslovakia, with a hyphen and not as one word.
Yes, indicating this traditional split.
Right.
But we might spend just a little bit more time with that. The Slovaks were under the control of the Hungarians for a long time and have a strong Hungarian influence, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And have also been traditionally very Catholic.
Right.
And in the Czech side, we think of Bohemia and so on, and going back to King Wenceslas and so on, who graces the main square in the great city of Prague. So Prague is located in the Czech part of
Yes, it is. It's in the western part of Czechoslovakia.
Right.
And the main city of the Slovak part is a city called Bratislava, which is on the Danube River.
Right, very close to Vienna.
Yes.
Within, less than an hour's drive, I think.
Much less. It's about 25, 30 miles down the Danube River.
Yes, So it gives us some feeling for this country of Czechoslovakia. I think the population is just under 16 million. It's something about the size of New York State. And it really an important element in Central Europe, as they like to call themselves. Very often they object to this idea that they are part of Eastern Europe. We usually lump them with the Eastern European countries, the Eastern Bloc and so on. But as a matter of fact, that's not the way they see themselves at all. They see themselves as the center point of Europe, really, and part of the Western culture, not part of Eastern culture. So that whole time in the Communist Bloc really was out of character for them. I mean, it was something imposed on them, very foreign to their mentality.
Completely out of character. Prior to the communist takeover in approximately 1946, 1947, they were one of the most advanced democratic countries in Europe.
Yes, very different kind of tradition. So we're talking, Mike, about Czechoslovakia. We want to look at it from somewhat from an economic kind of perspective. I think that's your area of expertise, is it not? I mean, not Czechoslovakia and economy. We got to make sure we get that straight. I mean, neither one of us want to pose as an expert on Czechoslovakia or its economy. But you are an economist by trade, not so?
Yes, I am.
And so that gives you at least some perspective to begin to deal with that. I've looked up some things about that, Mike, and I think if we could look back at the period, the communist period, and how this whole economy has gone, it's been a most difficult time. I visited in a tiny village near the Slovak border where my grandparents lived, and got to the house where my grandparents were and met the people in there. It was a marvelous experience for me to be back there. This was just in April of 1990 that I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And in the house there, I met the older gentleman, and he told me how when the communists took over, he had his own private land and was a farmer and was doing fine in this little tiny village. And when the Soviets came in, they collectivized the farms. And he described that as really quite a horrifying experience. I mean, this was, he didn't like it. He felt almost like a serf or a slave. Felt demeaned, dehumanized, and I think the general impression I got from him was that the people put into that kind of planned economy, the collectivized farms, were just did not work hard. That they didn't see any reason to work hard. There was no particular incentive. And to me, that sort of was typical, I suppose, of a lot of what happened to the economy under the communists. The planned, centralized economy, collectivized farms, I mean, simply didn't work. I mean, for 40 years they tried to make that work, and it really was, in essence, a disaster, I would say.
Right, and I should point out that my family had a similar experience to your grandfather. My father also owned some property right around that time. It was also taken over by the communists when they moved in and collectivized. So I share some of the experiences I think that your grandfather had.
Your own father had a sense, sort of a capitalistic sense about him, didn't he?
Right.
Growing up in Slovakia, I mean, I know he was sort of what we would call an entrepreneur, right?
Exactly. He had a fairly large-size factory in a Slovak town called Prešov that he had operated ever since he was a young man, and had built it up into a fairly prosperous capitalistic type of a business. And with collectivization and the rise of communism and what might you call it, a planned economy, he lost all of that. In fact, we had to leave it when we came to this country.
Yes, and that was, what years are we talking about there, Mike?
About 1946, 1947, when I was a small child.
Right, so we're right after the war.
Exactly.
Yes, and the communist takeover, and as I understand it, I mean, they simply came in and said, we are appropriating this factory, as they did all over the country. The state is taking it over. This is the essence of their economic system that they tried to impose on the country.
Exactly, and you had mentioned earlier about the lack of incentives that exist under communism, and I wanted to comment on that. The primary reason being that, to a large extent, the Slovak economy prior to that communist takeover, and in fact prior to the Second World War, was one of the most thriving economies of Central Europe. It looked as if they were going to grow into a very major industrial, post-industrial kind of a power. With the takeover by the communists, much of that came to a screeching halt. And as you mentioned, I would ascribe a good chunk of that to the lack of incentives that exist under a communist system. Basically, in my mind, there are two major problems with a sort of centrally planned communist system. Number one is planning, which I'll make a couple comments on, and number two, the lack of incentives. Going back to the planning part, under a communistic type planned economy, essentially the state determines what is going to be produced, where it's going to be produced, and who's going to get what. In so doing, if they are to respond to the demands of the populace, they need to have a tremendous amount of information to satisfy all of the demands the people have. To the extent that they somehow or other are able to obtain all that information, it's potentially a viable system. But how can one determine what's in the hearts of 16 million people in terms of what they perceive to be their economic needs? It's extremely difficult to determine that. As a result, you end up putting together plans that don't necessarily respond to the demands of the people or the demands of the businesses that exist in the country. Okay, so for that reason, planning, I suspect, would never work anywhere. With respect to the incentives, the way it operates under a planned kind of a system, there is no unemployment. There's no possibility of being fired because you're just employed by the state always, from the day you're born till the day you die. You're guaranteed a wage as a result. Whether you produce or you don't produce, you get paid. since you can't be fired and since you're guaranteed a wage, why should you work? For example, if you operate a farm, and let's say, well, let me use the example of like Florida. What would happen if we were to collectivize Florida and some of the orange groves that are down in Florida? Let's say that orange farmers in Florida realize that there's a major freeze coming, okay, because of a cold front moving south. We know that under a capitalistic system, that's their livelihood. Okay? If those trees die or get killed by the frost, there's no harvest at the end of the season, and as a result, there's no income. Under a planned economy or a collectivized economy, the farmer is paid by the state. You're not paid by the profits from the crops that you sell. As a result, if the freeze is coming, why should you worry about saving those trees? Why not just take it easy, let the trees get frozen? It's not your problem, and besides, you end up getting paid at the end of the month anyway.
So you end up with no real incentives here
Exactly.
to really care for the trees. And that's what we saw happen in Czechoslovakia. It's like the people I met there saying we were on the farms, but we didn't really work all that hard because we didn't see anything. And it's
Exactly.
the kind of situation you're describing that your grandfather went through. And I think that the Czech regime was especially intransigent in all of this. I'm thinking we all recall the Prague Spring of 1968 that we associate with Alexander Dubček and socialism with a face, a more humane approach. And after that, the communists installed Gustav Husak as the general secretary of the party and really the one running the country. And it seems that his regime was especially intransigent. I mean, you were talking about how hard it is for a centrally planned economy to respond to the needs of the people. It seems as though he got to the point where he didn't really want to do that. That the regime in Czechoslovakia was among the most repressive, and any reformist ideas were simply put down. And they had a great deal of trouble, making the economy work at all.
Essentially, he was acting as a puppet of Russia and had very little opportunity to do what he might have wanted to do. And Russia, very similar to what's happening now in, where was it, Lithuania, where there was a movement toward breaking away from the Russian bloc. A statement had to be made by the Russian government back in 1968 with respect to Czechoslovakia, because it looked very clearly that they were going to break away and try to become a capitalistic country as they had been prior to the Second World War. Either the Russians had to clamp down very, very violently, or otherwise they potentially lost many of the other countries that might have followed Czechoslovakia out of the Soviet Union. And as a result, when the new regime was installed after that spring of '68, after the tanks rolled through Prague and much of the country, the Russians just imposed their typical planned economy, centrally orchestrated out of Russia, back on the Czechoslovaks with a vengeance.
You know, and they really made it hard on the Czech economy, too, because the price of Soviet oil went up. I think it was around 1975, and the period after that, I think that the price went up quite a bit, and the Czechs were very dependent on the Soviet oil because, as they said, they did have an industrial base as well as the agrarian base that you described before. And so this total oil bill of theirs was just draining the country. They had no money to put into any kind of modernization. And so beginning in '75, it seems like they even went downhill. They had these various 5-year plans, as we associate with the Soviet Union and the other communist countries. They were running from 76 to 80 and 81 to 85. And they would write out these things, how they were going to improve the economy and make consumer goods more available to the people, etc. But none of that ever happened, partly because of their trade relationship with the Soviet Union, which made it more difficult for them. So what it seems as though what happened is the government was just trying to hang on. They weren't trying to improve anything if we can just maintain it. And my impression was that they blamed all of that on the people. They said we got to have greater austerity, people aren't working hard, there's certain managers that aren't doing their job and so on. But they never were ready to examine, is the system somehow wrong? Is there something wrong with this overall planned economy that we're trying to carry out? So against all reform, blame it on the people, on the workers, and especially these managers who were indeed inefficient.
Everything you're saying were the events that ultimately led up to what happened in
89
when it began in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
There was just a tremendous amount of disillusionment that had been building, in particular since that oil crunch that hit the world as a whole. It didn't just hit Czechoslovakia. I mean, we suffered through the oil shocks of the mid-'70s and then the latter part of the '70s. Well, likewise over there. And I think it particularly shocked the people in Czechoslovakia because they were used to controlled prices, controlled out of the Soviet Union. And when all of a sudden they were hit with those significantly higher prices, as you mentioned, it put a tremendous strain on the economy and led to a tremendous amount of disillusionment, which eventually culminated in that Velvet Revolution in the latter part of '89.
Which is so crucial in the whole history of the period and in Europe in general. I want to go back to before that actually happened. In 1985, there was a time when Husak went to Moscow. And now we're into the period of thinking about the reforms in the Soviet Union. And I think the people in Czechoslovakia, my impression at least, were getting very nervous about this. They didn't know how they were going to relate to the glasnost and the perestroika that was being talked about. And I know when Husak came back from his visit in May of 1985 to Moscow, he said this very pointedly to the Central Committee. We will not take the road of any of the market-oriented concepts that would weaken the system of socialist collective property and the party's leading role in the economy. We have had bad experience with that kind of thing. I mean, that's really an odd kind of statement to make.
Very odd
I mean, because if you look historically, as a matter of fact, when they did have this more progressive economy and a more market-oriented one going back to when your father was operating, I mean, things did go better for them. And he's saying that we've had nothing but bad experience. And also, looking at the world scene and seeing what was happening in the Soviet Union, Husak comes back in 1985 with this intransigent position and says, we're not going to do any of this market-oriented stuff. We're not even going to experiment with it in tiny ways as the people, for example, in Poland might have wanted to do.
I think one of the amazing things that I discovered when I visited there last August.
When you say last August, August of 1990.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that amazed me was that a number of people made the comment that it's been 2 generations. It's been 40 years that they've now been under communism. And with 2 generations being used to a non-market oriented kind of an economy, one tends to forget what some of the benefits are of that market orientation. And that's going to be one of the major problems there of trying to come to grips with modernizing that Czechoslovakian economy. People just have to relearn, in a sense, what it's like to be operating under a capitalistic system.
Yes, it represents great problems, don't they? I think that the Velvet Revolution that you described before, which occurred in November of 1989 and lasted for less than a month, the whole revolutionary process in less than a month, quite amazing. I think that part of what set the stage for that, again, was Gorbachev. Then Gorbachev, remember, he visited Czechoslovakia in April of 1987. And I think at that time there were certain sort of messages given out that things were going to have to change, and he set the stage, I think, for the part of this reform-minded business that was going to be going on. He was very much in tune with what they called the Charter 77 people. 1977, the group got together, about 1,000 people signed this charter looking for greater human rights, and I think it fit in with some of the stuff that Gorbachev was talking about. But I think that whole visit of Gorbachev to Prague really sort of enlivened this possibility that we were going to get reform and set the stage for the Velvet Revolution in November of 1989.
Well, the Russians, as you know, were having similar problems that the Slovaks were having with their economy, particularly in the latter part of the 70s and through the 80s. And they had, over the years, experimented little by little with more and more market-oriented kind of activity. As a matter of fact, only a very, very small part of their agriculture comes out of private plots of land. But that very, very small percentage of farmers who work on those small plots of land produce a tremendous, disproportionate amount of the total food products that are produced in Russia. And I think Gorbachev was trying to court with that whole market system little by little, and I think he was hoping to ease into it as time elapsed. But unfortunately, I think people were becoming tired of the kind of miserable economic conditions they were undergoing and wanted to see a change occur quickly.
Indeed. And that takes us, I think, to this whole question of since the Velvet Revolution in November of 1989, I mean, how the economy has been going and so on. I get the impression that you have different viewpoints on this within within Czechoslovakia itself, much like you see throughout Eastern Europe. I guess one style is sort of the shock approach that we see in Poland. I believe that Václav Klaus within the Czech government speaks in those terms of speeding the whole thing up and shocking and moving quickly to a market economy, taking all of the bad consequences like unemployment that's going to happen and rising prices, and I guess some inflation also, and to see what happens with all of that. On the other hand, I get the impression that Havel, the president, is more moderate in his view and has this sense that let's go more gradually into the market economy. So all throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, it seems the same debate is going on. How rapidly do you move to the market economy?
I think the difficulty that they're encountering there is that no one has any experience of how to go about doing this. In a sense, they're cutting a completely new path in the evolution of an economic system, and they're going cautiously, as I suspect they ought to.
That would be your opinion, huh, to move rather cautiously with it?
My inclination would be to say, don't spread the pain out over a very, very long period of time. Swallow the pill, let it hurt.
Oh, okay.
And move on. But at the same time, I don't think it ought to be done with any kind of extreme haste where you end up causing such hardships that there's a potential of ultimately having the people rise up saying we want to go back to the old system where it wasn't as painful.
Now, this is already happening, of course, in Czechoslovakia now. I mean, since the revolution, you have some of restaurants, for example, now have a great deal of autonomy. You'll see more varied menus. I mean, someone spoke about being in Czechoslovakia before the revolution and went in the restaurant and all three ordered different things and the same food came for each one. I learned that in the Soviet Union as well. The waiter would come up and say, what do you want? But it didn't matter what you said. You were going to get whatever they had prepared, which was usually one thing, although the impression was given that there was quite a variety. But everyone secretly knew you were going to get the same thing no matter what you ordered. So I think in Czechoslovakia that was the case before the revolution. Afterwards you begin to see a change in that. You see some of the small shops that are privatized and so on. You see people adopting a more entrepreneurial approach to things. Your father would be more at home in that situation, I suppose, today.
Exactly, and I was going to say that's going to be accelerating in the near future. It was perhaps 3 weeks ago I was away on a trip from Toledo, and I happened to be reading the paper on the plane, and there was just a very brief comment made about how the legislature had passed a law whereby private property would be given back to the former owners. I don't have any of the specifics. I haven't been able to locate any additional information on that. But I know it's moving in that direction and moving fairly quickly.
Yes, And of course there is the upset that goes with this. As you pointed out, a lot of this has to do with outlook and attitude. I mean, we're dealing with the people who over 40 years had sort of forgotten or had not known a market system, who were in a planned economy. And subway rides in the beautiful city of Prague were very cheap. I think it's something like 3 cents or something. And then now prices begin to rise in the stores, more goods available, but also harder to purchase them. And a certain amount of inflation that goes on with all of this. So that I think that you see a painful side to this, don't you? I mean, it's not been. Some people had this picture that as soon as you move to the free market economy, that everyone would live like people in Dallas, the TV thing, which they know about, the United States. And it hasn't happened, of course, and I think that creates certain strains within the country.
Sure, it can happen quickly. Just because of the kinds of difficulties it would cause, the kind of dislocation that it would cause. But I ought to point out, you were mentioning earlier that prices have begun to rise somewhat. From my experience last August, the prices in Czechoslovakia are, by our standards, dirt cheap. When you can get an entire meal for approximately $1.50 or $2, and a fairly good one, and as you mentioned, they're becoming more and more varied now also. when you can get a hotel room for $10 a night, it's just, by our standards, again, something just completely foreign to us.
I know friends of mine who want to go visit Prague for that very reason, that they see it as a beautiful cultural city and one that is relatively inexpensive these days.
Absolutely, and I would think that from an economist standpoint, one of the first things you would want to advise the Slovak government and the Czechoslovak government is to try to encourage tourism to Czechoslovakia, to bring in foreign exchange, which they're going to need very badly if they're going to try to modernize in the future.
I know Havel at one point talked about just within a few years that they would have a convertible currency. That would be good on the world market, that they would have some joint business ventures with Western companies, and that they would be on their way again to becoming a major industrial country. So Havel has great hopes along that line.
I think most of the people there have great hopes, but at the same time, I think they have an extremely difficult row to hoe. Much of their physical plant and equipment that they have in Czechoslovakia is outmoded, it's run down. There's a tremendous amount of capital investment that has to occur there over the next few years. Where this capital is going to come from is a question that the government's going to have a very difficult time responding to.
So the future, while there's a measure of hope, we have to bring in a measure of realism also. They have a tough road to go here. So we've been talking, Mike, about Czechoslovakia and the economic perspective on the country. We've seen the communist period was horrible with the collectivized farms, state-run. It simply didn't work. It collapsed. Velvet Revolution brought in a new opportunity and a movement towards the free market. And we have hopes now that under Havel and future leaders that Czechoslovakia will rise again to the kind of prominence it once had.